So this is the first in a series of web development, and we're going to go through all of the web development technologies, starting with HTML, which is really the starting point. So we're going to be doing HTML, CSS, JavaScript, ASP.NET, the whole works of technologies. But really, before you can do much with any web technologies, you need to know the underlying structure of a website, and that always starts with really HTML. So we're going to make a HTML page in this video. We're not going to go too much into depth into anything. So we're going to keep it nice and broad and talking really about just the structure of a HTML document, a little bit of detail about why certain things are the way they are. But then we're not going to go into great depth about each element and each thing we're showing. I'll then break that up into smaller videos. So hopefully the web series will be a lot more of shorter videos touching on specific points initially to get the basics out of the way and building up to a complete website. But websites can be made in bite-sized chunks. So hopefully these videos might be a little bit shorter than the other videos we do where we simply can't show concepts as quickly. So let's get straight into it, and we will start with creating a HTML page. So in order to display anything in a browser, and again, not exactly required, but it's typically you need a HTML page. So we'll just right click, create new document, and I've just created a text file. Just going to call this test, and then I'm just going to go over and rename the .txt to .htm and confirm. And now this is a website, or rather a web page. So if we just double click on this file, it will open up the browser in a big white screen. So that's ready in the browser. If we right click, or rather not right click, you don't have to, but in terms of editing HTML files, we could right click and open with, say, Notepad and simply start typing away. So if I did say h1 test, and this is not technically a valid page, but it'll show a header. And if we go to the web page and refresh, you'll see test. Let me just quickly turn on this toggle so it's not black. It's not all white screen. So you can see already a browser. So Firefox is quite happily now displaying a header. So we have a web page here, if you will, and we've got the file. So the first thing is, what do we then create this file in? Do we use Notepad? Do we use Visual Studio? The answer really is there's so many editors you can use to edit HTML. Some people like a full-blown IDE, like they like Visual Studio for code development. Personally, myself, for HTML files, they're that simple. I would typically just use Notepad. But in order to have a nicer editor, we can use Visual Studio Code. If you don't have it already, just download it and then just open up Visual Studio Code. And then you can open a file with Control-O and then select the test file that we just made. And this now opens up in Visual Studio Code. So now we can just edit in here. And you can see it's got some basic helpers here for a valid document. So let's just delete what we've done there. And before we start working on a HTML document, if you go to, where are we in Visual Studio Code? Extensions is this button here. There's a few extensions that I'd install to make this nicer work. So one is called HTML hint. So if you type in HTML hint, then, in fact, if I go to just installed, I should be able to see what I've got installed. And I'm sure it's called HTML hint. There we go. So HTML hint is one word. If you search and install this, it gives you some basic helpers on what we just saw, like some valid HTML to make sure we're not making any obvious mistakes. So if you install HTML hint, you'll get these kind of hints there, if you will. And then one more to install is called Live Server, I believe, which is here. And the icon looks like this. And all this is a mini browser. So it pops up a server. It makes a mini server for your file. So every time you edit it in Visual Studio Code, it will update automatically in the browser. So if you go ahead and install both of those and restart Visual Studio, you'll have the same extensions then as I've got. And then if we now go to this file, let's first make it valid, then we'll start up the server to start viewing it. So all HTML documents, this is similar to WPF in structure because it's an XML style structure. All HTML pages should start with curly brackets like this, angle brackets, just like WPF does. And the head is always an exclamation mark and then capital doc type, which is obviously for document type, and then a lowercase HTML. And you can see this extension. I'm thinking this is HTML hint that's doing this, giving you options to do certain things, and you click and it's actually made the whole document for us there. But we will delete, where has it done it here? Oh, it's not removed where I typed. So if you type just this, then you can see it's gone and dumped all this in for us. So I'm just going to delete that. But you start with a doc type HTML, and that defines that this document is a HTML file. What you will find in the web, though, is that, as we saw a minute ago, I don't have to type this. I can just type anything I want in. And the browsers are very good at simply ignoring errors and showing web pages from it. So you can, unlike C# and compiled languages where you can't make an error, in HTML you can technically type anything you like and it will always get displayed in the browser. And it will simply get displayed randomly or not the way you expect if you've typed something wrong. So you should always type valid HTML. But if you're wondering, or if you just say, oh, well, mine's worked without it, that doesn't always mean it's valid or it's good. It just means that you now might have unexpected behavior. So bottom line is, all HTML files start with doc type HTML. And this is simply a set definition. That's just what you type. And then below that, you want to, again, for sticking with valid and accurate HTML, you want to tell it what language this current web page is in. And this is for things like browsers and search engines and localization, to just give that hint to search engines and things of what languages within the document. And I'm going to do ENGB for Great Britain, or if you're in the US, it'd be ENUS. And then we close, or rather we don't close, we open the tag. So in HTML, you'll notice the element here has simply been opened and closed, and it doesn't have this pair. They're similar into WPF when you do things like, well, any element in WPF in XAML. You have your opening tag. So this is an opening tag where you basically have a lesser than arrow, then the name of this element, which is HTML. This is an attribute. So anything that comes inside of the first set of angle brackets other than the first element, which is always the name. Everything after that's an attribute. So this is called an attribute. This is called the element. And this is basically the start tag, which is the lesser than and greater than. So it's wrapped in a tag. And then you finish it with a closing tag, which is exactly the same thing, except you put a / after the first bracket. So if I were to do, say, a paragraph, it would look like that. So we have an opening tag, the name of the element, the closing tags, that forms the start tag. And then the end tag is the same. You do the opening angle bracket, a / and then the name and a close. And this is, again, I say identical to WPF and generally in XML documents. And then the content sits inside, like there. So structure-wise, when you see writing HTML, some of them you'll notice, this is a special case where you simply have no ending. So it's just one special tag, but in almost all cases, you'll see a start and a close tag. And again, there are elements that don't require that or do it differently, but for the most part, this is what you expect. An element name, open it, and then close it, and the content inside. So now we've got a HTML document, and we've defined that it's an English document, and the type is HTML. And now inside the HTML, so we'll tab in, this is now where you construct the real document, the thing that's going to get displayed in the browser. And really, you've got two parts to this. One's called the head, and one's called the body. And the head defines things like the title of this window, or on web pages, it defines the title of the web page. It also defines any styles you have in for visually styling the class, any JavaScript you have for doing code, any metadata for search engines, and other things. So the head is all the non-visual, non-direct elements that form the visual web page that you're looking at. So we put the head in, and again, you have to have a head. It's always got to be there for a valid document. And then interesting to see what this is complaining about. Or is that just a hint? Yeah, so you've got your head. And inside that, the most obvious and first one is title. So this is called my website. And now our web page should have a title of my website. And you'll notice again, the indents, and not necessarily the indents, they don't really represent the order. They should do, but if you keep track of when you've opened a tag, everything inside this until the closing tag is inside the HTML element. You open the head, so everything then inside of the head is, it's inside of head before the closing tag. So right now we have a tiered document going down. So you've got your HTML file that's got a head, and inside the head it's got a title. And now the body is separate to the head. So again, that you can see the line here of, think of it as indenting going further in. If you have a book that contains pages, and then pages contain words, you'd have, a book with pages and potentially page 1, and then you'd have some words. That type of structure. So, it's as you're going in, this is, your pages are here, so everything inside here is pages. You could have page 1 and then page 2 here. So these are children of the pages. So this pages has now got a list of elements, and they are page 1 and then page 2. Each page has got words, and then the book has pages. Or you could simply remove pages and directly put pages within the book. But the point of this is, and what I'm trying to explain here is, there's an order to, it's a structured document. It's a tiered document. It's not just all flat where it doesn't matter where you put things. It's all about the structure. So the HTML has to have a head and a body. So the head goes here, the body then comes below. And then you can see that we haven't put body inside the head, for example. The body doesn't go there inside the head. The body is separate. It's in line with the head. It's both of the body and the head are contained in HTML. And that's simply defined by, the order that you specify in these opening and closing tags. So every time you open a tag, you should technically indent the next item until you're done, and then it comes back out. So you can visibly see in a line then that, head and body are in, next to each other, the siblings, and the parent is HTML. So hopefully that makes sense. If not, you can also watch a video on WPF Basics that I did that kind of explains this as well. It's all a very similar structure. It's basically an XML structure. So we've got HTML, head, title, and body. So in the body, let me just literally write the word test for now and save. And let's get this visual going so we can start seeing what we're writing visually. So one way you could do that is to simply go to here, open your test file, and you can see it here. And you can see that it says my website in the header. So I make that a lot bigger. There's your text, there's your title. But the problem with that is now if we go back to Visual Studio Code and we say type test2 and save, if we drag this across and put this that side, you can see that this hasn't updated. And then we've got to refresh the browser page. So that is going to get quite annoying. So the point of installing the live server extension that we did a minute ago is because now, if you look at the bottom here, you've got this go live button. So if you click the go live button, it will spin up a little server and open it in the browser for you. And you can see it's basically the local host and then a port 5500 and then the name of the document. But the difference between this one and this one is now this one is live. So if I zoom this one in, maybe to 200, and I change back in Visual Studio, I change this to test3 and save, you can see this automatically updates. And the file we open manually stays the same. So all we've done here now then is spun up, we've clicked the go live button that's down here when you're in the document. And then it opens up this page in the browser, and now you can type on this side and see it happening this side. So we can already see now we have a title of a web page. So if I do my web page 2 and save, you can see the web page title updates. And now we're into the body, which is where the actual website starts to be constructed. So moving into the body then, we tab in, and inside the body we've got a lot of different elements that we can add that make up a website. And they range from headers, footers, paragraphs, images, lists, selections, you name it. There's a huge amount of elements that form a web page. So this video, the introduction, is really not to go into detailed explanations about each, how you'd style each one of them, the variations, why they're used, what they're used for in great detail. It's more just about getting you to get the environment set up, getting you familiar with, the structure, and if you've placed this here, it's inside of head, it's inside of HTML, it's not inside of the head, and what the head's used for, which is basically all the stuff that isn't physically in the body. It's stuff like the header and the included files. And to go about then adding elements, how you'd add them, how you'd open it up. And then we'll do future videos on going into specifics of elements and, focus on one element at a time and break it down so that you get a feel for how you do it. And then once we've got familiar with all of these elements, the general structure of HTML, and then how we start styling the documents in CSS and interacting with JavaScript, the videos will then go to longer videos where we start creating a real website. And this will be a fully functional live website when we're done. And what we'll start with, we were going to do a video on making the Facetto Word chat application website, which we still do. But I think in order to be able to create the UI, the actual website for that, you need a lot of knowledge behind first on how to make a general website before we go into full-blown chat application website. So we'll end up making two websites. We're going to make one that's for just a local company. I'm going to do the work for free, and I'm going to make them a website. And then you'll see the whole website done. You'll see it live. It will be a real website and real working, and you'll see the entire source code of how to do that. And then once we've done that, we'll move on to making the actual UI for the Facetto Word application. So we're going to make two full websites, but this first one will be a more, what I'd say, static website. It's simply almost a portfolio or a website that doesn't have constantly changing content like blogs and things like that. So we'll get started with this. We've got the body. And as I said, there's lots of different things you can put inside the body. So one is a header. So if you type H1 as your element, and it'll open and close for you. I think I've also got an extension for that, actually. I think it's called auto close tag, I think. So if you install this auto close tag as well, then when you're typing like H1 and close, it automatically adds the closing tag for you at the end. Otherwise, you just have to type that yourself. So if we didn't have that installed, say my header, then you'd have to close it like this. So if you install that extension, it should close them for you. So this now is the first element inside of the body of the web page. So because this is right here, it's inside the body, this is now a correct, valid HTML document. If we save, you can see the header has now appeared, and there's nothing to reference it around to see how big it is or what it is, because it's the only element. But a header, and specifically a H1, is the largest header by definition that it's meant to be. H1 is the most important header. So if we copy and paste that line a few times, 2, 3, 4, 5, say 6 of them, and we change this to header 3, header 4, header 5, header 6, and also change the closing tags, and then save, you can see we have a big list of headers that by default simply go down in size. So depending on, you shouldn't really make a header depending entirely on size, because that's the point of HTML, is to define a structure of a document. It's not to define the style. So it has a little bit of similarity between what we're doing in WPF, where we're talking about like view models and actual views, and separating the concern of a visual view with the structural representation, if you will. So truly speaking, a HTML document should have no definition of UI or specific visual elements, that you should simply define what's expected as an overall. So we expect header 1 to be generally representing a large header, then the most important header, and header 2 is less important, header 3 is even less important, and so on. So that's all that this should really define. So if you wanted a header this big with a subtitle this big, you shouldn't do header 1 and header 6. What you should do is do header 1 and header 2, and then you should style header 2 to be the size that you like. But again, that's getting too in-depth for an initial video. but that's just a brief description of, just because you'll visually see something here in all these elements doesn't mean that that's the way they have to look, and nor should it mean that you structure your document based on that, because as you'll see as we go forward, we'll style all these elements completely separate. So we have headers here. If you want to do comments in HTML, it's basically a less than angle bracket, exclamation, 2 minus signs. And then the closing tag for that is 2 minus signs and a greater than. So it's a bit of a different style of writing. It's similar to this special tag here, where it's kind of the opening one starts with an exclamation as well as then a name. And this is really, the name is simply 2 dashes in this case. So you'll get used to typing that anyway, and you'll remember. And now in here, you can type a comment. So I'll say headings. Then after headers, say you just want some text. So let me just remove a few of these first so it doesn't fill up the screen. After headings, let's put some text. So in general, when you're writing on a website or you've got some text to display, you'd write a paragraph, as it's called. So a P element is short for paragraph. And then this is a paragraph of text. And save that. And you can see there's the paragraph of text. And you can see in relation to the headers as well, the general size, but again, don't rely on this being the final size. It simply gives you an overall. This is styled by the browsers. So if we open this in Internet Explorer, it might look different because each browser has its own default style. So we will put here paragraph. After a paragraph, you've got, say you wanted to have a link to a website of Google. So in here you can say, let's put it in a paragraph again. And this is a link to Google. And then we'll put inside here an A element. So if you do an A element like this and say, click here and save. So all we've done is we've now put an A element, an anchor, which is a link, inside of P, because you can see we haven't closed the P tag yet. So because we've opened P, then put some content, then included A inside of it, effectively A is inside of P as structure. But if we save this, you can see we've made an anchor, but doesn't do anything when you click, because you have to tell the anchor where to go. So in the anchor as an attribute, which if you remember from the HTML up here, anything inside of the opening tag of an element is an attribute. So in here we do href, which is the name of the attribute, and that simply means the reference to where the link is going to go when we click it. Put equals, and then put 2 quotes because we're going to define a string. And this will be http www.google.com. Save, and now you can see it's turned into a website link that when we click takes us to Google. So we'll put a comment on here. This is links, anchors. I think that's how you spell anchors. Maybe. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'll do for now. Next we have images. So for this, we're going to have to find an image to link to show an image. So bear with me a second and I'll find an image. So I found a little image here of my dog. I've got a little pug. So it's a big, huge image, but we're going to include it anyway to show you. So to include an image, I've noticed I've placed this in the same folder as the HTML file. So we can reference it relative by just typing image.jpg. So that's where it is. Now in here, to do an image, simply open a tag img, which is short for image. And then in certain, I mentioned at the start, certain elements don't always need to have image open, image close like this. And the reason for that is an image can't have content directly in here. You can't define an image, well you can, but again, in general, you shouldn't, and you can't define an image element by simply putting data in here. So therefore, you don't have an image element opening and closing a tag like this. All you do is make a shorthand. So instead of having to type image, open and close the tag, then doing an open close end tag, simply delete that one and you end it with just / angle bracket. And that's now defined an image, just like you defined a P where you do this. and you've got an opening and a closing. This time the closing is simply shorthanded and just you put a forward slash at the end of the first tag. So that's defined an image. So we save. Can't see anything because we haven't defined where it is, similar to the link. So now you need to say, well, where's my image? So for this, you type src, which is short for source, I believe. Same as the link, put it as a string, and type in image.jpg. And when we save now, you'll see an absolutely massive picture that we need to shrink down a bit. So we've got an attribute of source, and here in order to shrink this down, I will just simply type another attribute called width. I'll say equals 500 as an integer. And now this is technically not what you'd want to do. The value of attribute w must be used in double quotes. So even though it's an integer, like in C#, you'd expect to type it. In HTML, you'd expect it, the attribute's value to be in quotes. And now you can see there's my image. And look how handsome he is. So there's a 500 wide image. And then the height is automatically adjusted. So again, there's loads of things you can do with images. But for now, that's just a quick way to show you how to place an image in a website as well. I will note that this is a definite no-no to place an 8 MB file as an image on a website, but that's for future videos when we come to handle optimizing websites and making sure that images are as compressed as possible and shown only as large as they need to be, all things like that. But for now, that's all we need to know about an image. So we have images. Next we'll have, let me define, because things that we come to afterwards are going to start doing what's called inline versus block in the layout. So when we talk about block elements, we're talking about things like the headers and the paragraphs, where basically we place a header, then another header, and they appear below each other because each of them is a block and it takes up the whole width of the web page. So each header and each paragraph is a full block. So if we make the width of this image 50, and after the image we place, say, a span, which we haven't come to but will, and I save, you can see even though these are below each other, both of these elements, an image and a span, are what's called inline. So they only take up the desired amount of space. They don't go all the way over and then start a new line. So a block element takes up the entire width of the document, and an inline element will simply fall in line, as it suggests, with the each element next to it. So we can just copy and paste 3 or 4 times and they'll just keep lining up until they get to the very end, where they'll then roll over and carry on. So there's inline versus block, and the simplest way to show this, I do inline versus block. A paragraph is your most classic block element for simply text. So this is a paragraph, and we save that. We'll see it's on a new line. If we copy and paste 2 of them, you'll see you have 2 lines. A span, on the other hand, is basically similar to a paragraph, to simply put text within. It doesn't have to be text. A span can be anything, but it's a generalized element for placing content inside that's inline. So this is block. This is going to become inline. So this is a span. And if we copy and paste 2 of those, you'll see that, like the example above that we just did, these 2 are now in line with each other. They fall one after the other. So that's something to bear in mind as we move forward with videos. If you're wondering why, when we get to styling elements or placing elements, and you're wondering why has this not gone on a new line type of thing, why is it merged in, and you might want it to do the opposite. Well, that's where styling comes in. So you don't define the structure of your website with the intention of it being visibly a certain way. You should define it, more semantically, if you will. But there is a very bad habit in web development that still persists to this day, and I'll almost guarantee that 99% of all web developers still do this, where they will define something in an element purely for the sake of it being a visual representation. So if they're expecting a new line, they'll define something with a paragraph, or they might even say, I wanted these 2 spans to be, below each other. So they'll put a break in to basically force it onto a new line like this. And these are bad habits. These are not what you should see and not what you should do, but I'll guarantee you will see it happening. Just bear in mind that it's not really the way that it should be done. So if you're doing it 100% correct and clean and the way we want it, a lot of the stuff we will do in these videos, you will find online, again, 99% of people doing it different ways. And that's simply because they're outdated and they're used to doing it one way, and web standards are always changing and always going, very modern standards that people just simply don't learn. They're in a job, they're doing the job day in, day out. They don't constantly spend the time staying up to date with technology or up to date with standards. So just because that's the case, and just because you can do it one way and another way, there's 1,000 different ways to do things in websites. The way I'll show you will be as modern as I know, so as up to date as I know the web to be, and I'll also explain along the way why we do things we do. So that's what we're going to do. In terms of element, here's a perfect example of where I'm saying one thing can be done one way or another, and I'll leave this up to you to Google, and you have a feel for what you believe is the correct way and post a comment. But a good example of one thing being done one way and another all over the web is the break that we just saw. So I mentioned that almost every element in the web page has an opening tag and a closing tag, and if it doesn't, it then at least has an opening tag with a closing shorthand tag. But then you get to a situation like this where you have a break line. So we put BR and we end it with a tag. But what you'll also notice and see is that if we copy that a few times or copy it once more, that'll keep them all on new lines. But you'll also see people that do just that, which to me would instantly say, well, this break has opened and never closed, so therefore I expect this span to be contained within this BR and also not closed. So to me, visually, that looks wrong. That is, well, how do you know this is ever closed? Similar to an image, yes, an image has no content directly in it, but I still expect to see the tag closed. And that is true, you have to do that in an image. But you'll notice in BR, it's not giving me an error either way. So that's a good example right there of where web standards were messed up and where people started doing it one way, and then a new standard comes and tells you to do it another, but it doesn't look right. So I'll leave this little thing up to you guys to Google and give your opinion in the video of what you feel is the correct way of writing BRs, which are basically forcing a new line in text. It's like adding, literally pressing enter, but actually in the document. So it forces a new line. So I'll leave that one up to you there, but there's those little things to be aware of in HTML, where there's lots of different ways of doing everything. So we'll carry on working through a few more elements. So another one that's not used very often, in fact it's rarely used, is a horizontal rule. So a line straight through the width of the container, in this case, which is the whole document. And here's another example of where you don't close the tag, funnily enough. And you'll see here now we've got this big line, just a horizontal rule. And if we were to put something below that, which we'll do in a second, you'll see it appear below. So this is a horizontal rule. And again, bear in mind, when you're picking elements to use in HTML, you're not picking them because you expect it to be a grey line like this. You're picking them semantically. In fact, that the document should have a horizontal rule. And by definition, what is a horizontal rule? So it's like, what are you expecting it to define in your document? So that's, again, where we come down to semantics in websites. For example, an image is going to display an image, but it doesn't say, what this technically wouldn't be in the HTML, this would be in a CSS file. So you wouldn't even usually define the size of an image, that'd be in the style. It'll come clear when we do more elements anyway, I'll talk about that in a moment. So another one is called a block quote. This is a block quote, and if we save again, you'll see by default the website styled this block quote with an indent, because that's how you typically would see a quote, with maybe quotation marks top and bottom. If not, it's like a site where it's gone in. But in terms of HTML, you'd use a block quote when you're expecting this to actually be a quote from somebody. So you're not picking it because it would be represented this way, because we can style it another way. You're structuring this document because inside the document, potentially you've got a quote from somebody. So you'd use block quote. But the difference between most of these elements, again, is not the style, because we could use a CSS style sheet and make this paragraph, this span, this block quote, and the headers all look exactly the same in style. The point of when you're defining your HTML document is to simply define the document as you're making your website, and define it for the content that it is. So if you're making the main content, say a web page has a main content and a sidebar, say for a menu, then you'd have probably like a main element like this, and then you'd have an aside like this that's defining that it's technically the main content goes here and the aside goes here. But this doesn't define in any way where the main is, how it looks, how it's structured, neither does the aside. But in terms of then search engines and all AI that's trying to interpret websites and potentially style them and do certain things with them, they're looking for these modern structures. So again, I don't expect you to fully understand each one of these. We'll explain them more in depth in videos. But I'm at least trying to show you most of the basics so you can at least get a feel for what tags are available to you. So a block quote, again, you typically do if you have an actual quote to be shown. What else do we have? We have a good one is for developers, say. So some code. And code in Visual Studio, and like as we're typing here, you'll notice, if I type MMM, which is 4 big words, and then III, which is smaller, you'll notice they're exactly the same size. And this is called monospace, rather, which means the spacing, the size of each character is this exact same width. And we're used to that in Visual Studio when we're typing. So we expect everything to line up, and it helps us visually with what we're doing then in code. So in order to have text that is expected to be the same width for every character, we can do what's called a pre, which stands for pre-formatted. And then we'll do, say, var item1 equals, let's do that MMMM. And if we save this, you'll see it's now got a monotone text, and it's got a certain amount of width. So if I copy and paste that twice, I change the ITM for, say, sum, change that for 2, just so it's different values, different sizes. Change that to eyes, and you'll see they're exactly the same width. Now, if I did the same thing in just paragraphs, then it won't use a monospaced font, and you'll end up with this. So when you're displaying code, you typically put it inside of a pre-block. You've also got code if you want to do it inline. So p when using the, and then open a code block, item1, and come out of the code block, variable, blah, blah, blah. And you'll see here then, we've got a paragraph, which is a block element that has the content here. This is the content inside the P. And we say when using the, and then we actually tag the item1, we wrap it in a code tag, just like we wrapped the link here in the paragraph. So this is inside the paragraph. And then we define code, and code is inline, so it doesn't force a new line, stays inline there. And P is a block. Now pre, this one here, is also a block element, you'll notice. You put 2 in a row, and they'll go on a new line. If we were to put code here, you'll see that code is an inline element. So it won't start new lines, just like the other elements wouldn't. So if I quickly do this and save, you'll see now this is the code part where they've all gone in one line, and this is the pre. And then also in similar fashion, if we change the code in here to pre, you should notice that it will start a new line. So when using the, and then item1 variable. So you wouldn't usually do that because you're inside a paragraph, you'd use code. So again, I don't want to go too much into the specific differences of say like pre versus code, because that will be future videos. But in short, both of these are expecting, mono spaced font. That's by definition. It doesn't know what font it's going to use or style, but simply this is semantically saying the content inside here should be represented with a monospace font. The same with code. But the only difference really is that pre is block, so it will go on new lines, and code is inline, so it won't force new lines. And that's just a brief summary again, so there'll be more detail on those in future videos. We've got code elements. Let's move on to lists. So sometimes you see lists in websites. There's quite a few types of lists, but the most common used ones in HTML are unordered and ordered lists. So an unordered list with UL has items inside called list items. So that's what li stands for. Item 1. If we then copy and paste that a few times, why is it indenting the wrong amount? Item 1, 2, 3, and save. So an unordered list, each item is effectively not numbered. There's no specific order to this list. So therefore it's represented by default again visually just with a bullet. And you've got a list of 3 items. You'll notice also that list items are block items. That's why they start on new lines each time. And the unordered list is keeping that list of items inside a group, if you will, a collection. So the UL is the list itself, and the li is each item, and it stands for unordered list and list item. And then another example of a list, we simply copy and paste all of that and paste in. Not sure why it keeps thinking this indentation's wrong. So all you do for change from an unordered to an ordered is change the parent and save. And you now see this list as being default represented by actual numbers, because that's what we're expecting in an ordered list. We don't have to say this is, for item 1, you don't have to put, 1 there. You can just say item, 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 and it will give you, the numbers automatically. But again, we're defining this purely because we're expecting it to be either an unordered list or an ordered. And it's almost always an unordered list. You'll see there's not very often a case where you need to have a list that's ordered. It doesn't mean that the browser would display this with item 3 first, for example. Although you could do that with JavaScript and some tweaking, but it simply is defining that, say, an ordered list is expected to never change order, and an unordered list, even though it 99% of the time shouldn't change its order, technically there's no rule saying it has to be in that order. So again, you'll see mostly UL listed everywhere in sites for lists, but there's also ordered lists, and there's also a few other lists that they use that infrequently. I won't even bother showing them. We've covered links, which we've done up here for visiting other web pages or parts of the same website. Now we've got, say, some bold text. So in a paragraph, we will say some, and then we'll put B, which stands for bold, and then outside of that text, and some, and then we'll do strong text. So here we've done a paragraph that contains some strong text. So we've got a paragraph that contains this bit of information here inside the paragraph. And then we've done a sentence that says some, and then we've put bold inside of this B element, and then the word strong inside of the strong element. And if we save that and scroll down, you'll see some bold, where bold is bold, text, and some strong, where strong is also bold. And this again, that you might say, well, what's the difference between B and strong? This kind of brings us onto a subject that we're going to find hard to ignore, but I'm really trying to not go into depth in the video on semantics of things, but we can't really ignore it fully. In short, you typically use B when you are making a website, and this you're talking years ago now, where the developers of HTML and the styles and the standards were in the early days, and you'd write something and you'd have some text, say, or whatever it was, and you want it to be what you'd call bold. Now, the problem with bold and the problem with B is, one, B isn't very descriptive, it's just a letter. So really, you'd want to say bold, but you don't. And two is bold is an explicit declaration. Bold is saying that I expect the text to be fatter text. It's explicitly stating for something to be visually bold. And that's not the job of HTML. The visual element is not the job of defining, a HTML element here, and to say I expect it to be visually fatter, visually bold. So that's kind of that's bad practice in HTML. And again, I'll guarantee you'll see this all over the web. You may even find it on some very high-end top websites. So you might think that, oh no, the big guys wouldn't make these mistakes, but trust me, they do. These are this is just how it's always been, and that's why it's still around. And it's simply a very slow pace of moving with the times and doing things correctly. The same in all languages. People have done something one way all their lives, so they do it that way. So in HTML, really, if you want to make something bold, you're making a statement that you expect it to be just like this, visually fatter text. That's not what you want to do these days. Instead, you want to state this strong word, which you'll notice by default, again, bear in mind that the website styles it default a certain way. Doesn't mean that it has to stay that way. But by default, strong has been styled just like bold. It's said, okay, I'll make this text stronger. I'll make it bolder. That's fine. But the key difference here is strong is simply semantically saying that the content inside here should be stronger than the surrounding content in some way. It's not saying that it should be fatter text, because you might use strong inside of some other content. It's simply a statement that, again, semantically speaking, this content needs to be stronger. And literally that's as far as it's saying. The word strong is up to interpretation then of whoever's styling the website, whoever's reading the website. It's a definition of what should this be. It's not saying bold. Bold is a definition of an actual visual style. Physically making a bold font is a hard defined style, whereas strong is, up for interpretation. You can style it however you like. So if the developers of a website decided all strong text wants to simply be yellow instead of white or instead of black, and that's what they're defining in their visual style or their visual structure of the website, they're styling basically. They're saying, no, I want all strong elements to be yellow. That's fine. But if the HTML was saying B, it's kind of just arguing against the style sheet. So instead of it saying, well, I want all bold elements to no longer be actually bold text, I just want them to be yellow, then it's kind of a contradiction. So that's why HTML should not make any kind of definition of hard UI styles. And it's hard to explain in the very first video, but it's one of those things similar to when I started the C# videos. I was very adamant on making comments everywhere and using regions and keeping code clean. And at the start, you might not have seen a use for it or a benefit. But as applications grow and you've got thousands of lines of code, you start to then appreciate these things. So in a similar fashion with HTML, I would say right now, you might say, well, what's the difference between bold and strong? And it's quicker to type B, and I see B used everywhere in tutorials, all this lot. That's fine, but trust me, if you can make a start on HTML and you do it the correct way, which is things like constantly thinking that HTML should not define visual states, and instead you should be simply semantically stating something a bit more vague of, expecting it to be a certain way, then that's going to really benefit you when you come to learn everything else, because you'll be far ahead of most people in web development. You'll have, more up-to-date knowledge, and again, it'll be nicer to see. It'll be more semantically structured. So we'll move on from that conversation now. Hopefully I shouldn't have to keep repeating myself. I'll simply, make a brief statement about that. But we'll now move on to just a few more things, and then we'll start doing videos on specifics. So something else you can do as well as bold, we just copy and paste that. We'll do italic, and this is another good example of when we're defining something a certain way. And again, this is something I think you should Google and post comments back on what you believe, because this is also one that's got a very complicated answer. So italic. Now, the issue comes here. Let's finish this off first and put some italic text and some emphasized. Oop, if I could spell. Emphasized text. So if we save this and you look here again, you've got italic, which is a slanted font, and some emphasized text, which is a slanted font. So again, this is another argument, and again, I really won't go too much in depth here, but it boils down to a similar question about bold and strong. So bold is, without any shadow of a doubt, a hard-coded visual representation. A bold font is expected to be fatter than a non-bolded font. That's simply the case. Italic, most people will say, is exactly the same thing. An italic font is always going to have a forward slant compared to a standard font. So therefore, is this a visual style and shouldn't be in HTML? Or is it the fact that italic is sometimes required, non-visually, to give meaning to the content? So does italic content have a specific meaning, regardless of it being visually shown or not, in terms of bold? Now, bold font is up for interpretation. A bold font might mean pay attention to it, or it might be any other reason. It doesn't have a set reason. But the question is, does italic? And that's something, like I say, I'll let you Google. But here you can simply see a very similar statement as bold and strong. Emphasis, on the other hand, is 100% semantic. If you want to emphasize something visually, you have 1,000 options there. You can put a black background on, you can put a flashing light on, you can make it bolder, you can make it bigger. You can do anything you like visually. So therefore, HTML defining this content as simply being emphasized is good, because applying emphasis to something is not a purely visual thing. When you describe you're emphasizing something, like if I want to emphasize this statement, I can put emphasis on it, I can keep repeating it, I can say it with a more stern voice. It's not a visual only description. And that's what the semantics is. It's that basically that in itself, that you're putting description into a word. So you're emphasizing, you're telling it that this expects to be emphasized. Whereas italic, if you say something's italic, you can't make your voice italic. You can't talk in an italic way. You can't, it becomes the question of, is this purely a visual definition? So again, feel free to Google that. If not, just use it as like this. I'd say then use emphasis instead of italic. But then you'll see why. If you just Google that for more info, you'll get the gist of that. So again, this is what I call explicitly visual style. This is what I call semantic, the same as the emphasis. So these, I'd say, personally, are the correct replacement for these two, with special attention being on this. You might Google it and tell me I'm completely wrong. So go ahead and do a bit of research on that if you like. But there's some bold and italic, HTML. Now we'll just move on to one element that you'll see a lot, that again is kind of overused, but you will see it. And this is this div. And div is really, let's see what the HTML hint gives us. So a div is an element that has no special meaning. It represents its children. It can be used within a class, blah, blah, blah. So what does that mean? This means it's kind of almost completely against HTML. Again, the modern HTML is meant to define the structure of the document and what's in it and what each element is representing. But div is clearly stating it has no meaning. Basically, it's saying, here's some HTML content inside of here that I have no definition about. There's no reason for it. So if anything, I'd say this was a group, to do nothing more than group elements together in the document that can't be defined in any other way. So if you have elements in a document and you've got, say, a group of photos that are referring to a holiday, and you wanted to put a bunch of images in here, but you want to group them, if you will, into a holiday group, you could use a div then. But if you were doing the side menu, say, well, you've got a perfect tag to use then, and this is this aside. Oh, what have I done there? Gone full screen. So you've got like an aside that you can make use of. So whenever you can define a HTML element that explains the content within it, you should. But before, again, modern web, you didn't have main, you didn't have footer, you didn't have aside, you didn't have all these extra tags in HTML for groups of content. you just had div, really. So div become the universal and probably most used HTML element on the web. I could be wrong, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was. So you'll see div a lot, and div is used to group elements together or to put content within inside it. But also, it's massively misused in terms of making CSS styling work. So again, we'll see in future when we come on to styling, and we'll probably end up using this ourselves in styling, because you'll realize that as much as you want to follow all these plans of the HTML should not add any style-based elements that define UI, you'll find, unfortunately, the way that CSS and HTML are at the minute, they're still transitioning into a state where CSS is actually powerful enough to do that without needing HTML elements. So you will find in future videos that will have a certain element that wants to be visually displayed a way that we simply have to add, say, extra divs, or we have to wrap an image in a div for no other reason than to get it visually styling correctly on the website. And that's really like an annoyance in HTML that I do not like, is that it's now got a definition of how it should be and what you should do, but the technology isn't advanced enough to allow you to do it pure. So you will get some parts of HTML where, as much as we try to stick to everywhere we can, that HTML defines the layout and CSS does the styling, there will inevitably be a crossover between the two that you simply cannot ignore. So there's nothing really more to say on a div other than it's a general container, and until we get further in and you see them used. So all I'm going to say on the div is that you will see them a lot. You will see them used correctly and incorrectly, mostly incorrectly, and that it's simply really somewhere to place content inside. So if we did a div with a span of test, and we did 2 of them, and I still think this indentation's messed up in this document. For some reason it thinks, in fact I probably know why it thinks it, probably from that bold that we showed, the break line we showed somewhere. I bet this thing keeps screwing up the indentation of my document for me. Let's try and paste another one. Nope, it's not that. Anyway, for some reason my document keeps misaligning the elements and wanting to force them out. So we have a div with 2 spans, and you can see they've gone on new lines. And we know span is inline. So what that also tells you is div, by default visually, is a block element. So it fills the whole width and goes to new lines. So that's just another little thing to bear in mind about divs, that they are also effectively blocks. We will now do a few things that are input elements, if you will, from the user. So one's a button that you define by typing the word button as your element name, and then inside you put the content. Let's say my button, and save, and you can see now we've got a button here that's clickable. And then you could do things with that. Again, we're not going to do anything specific with them. So buttons. And if you're wondering, again, I know I keep saying this, but if you're wondering what to do with them, or how do you then do anything when you click the button, or all that kind of info, I'm going to do separate videos on each element. So don't worry about details about them. This is the real broad overview of generally getting going with HTML and getting a structure going. So as well as a button, we have labels, which typically accompany text boxes or buttons, like you want a username. So the label would be, say, username, and you save that, and you'll notice now that the label is an inline element. So let's just do a wrapper around that of P and put it on a new line. We could also just wrap each of these elements in a P, just so they all appear on their own line. So you've got a button, you've got a username as a label, and then you could have a text box, which is basically input, and a value this time. So inputs don't have the standard open close, they have the shorthand. So inputs have, and move it out to the P so you can see, inputs do the the open and the shorthand close. So then how do you specify? If we save so you can see what an input is, An input is a text box to input data. So that's what input is. How do you define the text inside before it starts? You use an attribute called value. And then you say my text. Or you should do. Why is that not showing? Is it this style? Maybe my overridden style? No. Oh, it's just not refreshed for some reason. Okay, so that should work. Input value. Okay, it's just some kind of caching going on with the website is somehow caching my response. It thinks I've got that data. So if I were to close and reopen this, if I just close that and go live again, it's there. So for some reason, because I started typing in there, whenever I refresh this page, it was kind of holding on to my value. It was trying to remember what I typed. So that's an input box. The labels are usually, so if you see username, and this should be the username the user enters, typically for accessibility, when you click this username, you should focus on this text box. So a real quick way of doing that is make a name for this, and in the label, type the word for, and give it the name of the text box. So now if we do that, when we click username, it should, it's not going to, highlight my text when you click this. So why is that not working? So a quick look. Name. Yeah, so we've got name, we've got for. Again, does this just need closing and opening maybe? No, we've got some visual. Okay, well, we'll skip over that for now, and when we focus on a video on these things, this should work though. Basically, you should have, you know, a name specified, and then a label can be for, and you give it the name of the control, and that should effectively mean that when you click the label, it goes to the input. In fact, let me just fix this. So it'll make good use of a website where I'll tell it to go anyway. So if we go to, this is a link I'll put in the description of the video. It's basically Mozilla. If I just turn off the black style for the moment, it's basically Mozilla's reference document to say all HTML elements. So this is a good place to see all of the elements that are in HTML. So a lot more than we're showing here. But this is a great place to get your up-to-date standards, if you will, and up-to-date information, because this is kept very up-to-date. So I'll put a link in the description of the video for this. But we'll now use this to also fix this issue. So I'm positive this is right, but it's funny how it's not working. So all we need to do is, in this document, we'll scroll down, or we can search, and we'll look for a label or a text box, and we'll have a look how they give you a good example of, you know, where you use things. So if we go to, say, input, and let's see if this gives an example of a label. It doesn't. So go back one. Let's go for the actual label then. So Control F, and let's search for label. Labels there. And there we go. So label is just below input, right below actually. So if we click into here, let's have a look how it's recommended to be used. And you can see label for username. And then, there you go. There's the key difference. It's not name. I'm getting too used to WPF. It's ID. Of course it is. I've been doing WPF that long. I've forgotten that a website uses IDs, not names. So change the input to ID equals my input. And now when we click this username, you can see it's selected the text we're ready to type. So that's the point of how you'd usually use a label. You'd usually use a label to, as the name suggests, label some kind of content or input. And then you can use this tag to give it the ID of an element that we're talking about. So that might work for a button as well. Let's try button ID equals my button. And we'll say this label is for my button. Now if I click this, does it focus? Yeah, it actually clicks the button for us. So you can use a label in this for attribute to kind of repurpose a label to make use of it however you like. So I'll change it back to my input for now and get rid of that. So we've got buttons, labels, text boxes, which are called inputs. We have, say you want a multi-line text box, you want them to type a comment for their order or something. So for that, we'll do what's called text area. And that is an opening closing tag. And then you get this multi-line text area where the user can type in. And you can also predefine some text in there, which again, on this seems to constantly remember my text. But if I close that, restart, and there we go, we've got the predefined text. So this is a multi-line text box. And we'll do one more, and I think that's enough for this video. We haven't got any kind of drop-down list. So to make a drop-down, you do a select as the group. So this is something you want to select. Group of options to select. Then inside there, we want the actual options themselves. So we'll do option. Option 1, copy, paste, say 3 times. And save. And now we have a drop down with options 1, 2, and 3. You can also add an attribute, I think it's called just selected, to an option. And then by default, it should select, or is it selected equals true maybe? Again, if we're in doubt, we can go to the Mozilla link, but I think I'm pretty sure you just put selected in, and it's probably this just needs refreshing yet again. There we go. So what we clearly noticed in this video, by the way, is this live server in Visual Studio Code is actually not that great. It seems to keep hold of some. It's like it's trying to remember what you've done. Like if you type in here and do option 1 and then do that and then refresh, it's keeping hold of that data. So if I go to the desktop and open up the HTML directly, let's just prove this is not Firefox, it's the actual, it's the live server thing. If I go in here and do the same thing and I refresh, oh no, so this is actually Firefox doing this. So it's nothing to do with the live server. It's if we start typing, Mozilla's just remembering what we've typed and kind of ignoring the predefined options. So that's just the browser doing what it's doing. But if you're wondering, like you type selected and you're wondering if it's worked, you're best to double check. So you're best just closing down if you're unsure and clicking, the go live again and just rechecking to be sure. So that's really all I'm going to do on the introduction to HTML. I've hopefully covered all the basics of how you define a structure, what it means to be inside of elements, and the tiered structure of a document. We've really emphasized the fact that although you will see it everywhere, HTML should not really be used for defining any hard set visual things. That should be left up to CSS. Hence the semantic side versus the defined side, which is really obvious in like a bold and a strong. That's the most easy way to explain that issue. And then we've kind of just dumped in a load of all the most common web things that you'll see. So, headers and paragraphs, pictures, spans, lines, buttons, all stuff like that. And then as we move on, we'll either go through just specific elements and focus on them, or what I think we'll start doing is making a really simple part of a website. So not a whole website to start with, but we'll pick a part, like maybe we'll pick a menu, and we'll start, focusing on that and then explaining elements in context. So if we want to make a top menu, like on a website, so if I then go to angel6.com and you wanted this menu to be made, for example, then we'd start with a list, because this is a list of things. This is a menu and each element is a list. So then I'd focus that video on lists, but effectively you'd be making a menu to a website, and things like that. So we'll do them in short chunks, but we will do them in context, because that's the best way to learn. So that's it for this video. One thing I keep forgetting to mention is there's a lot of time that I get where people ask me questions, or there's topics I need to cover, and they're simply too short for a video. Like a 5-minute thing, if that. And it's not worth the time and effort to make a video on it. So I've set up a blog, which is blog.angel6.com. I've just used GitHub pages to make a nice, simple, really easy blog. And then I've put the first post on there to simply state, you can have a read of it, but it basically states that exactly what I've just said. There's certain things when I want to just show you guys how to do something, or I've done something in the general course of my workday that we've solved a problem, or we've done something that I feel just, should be given out as knowledge, that's a useful tip, but it just isn't big enough for a video. So if you're really interested, you can, keep refreshing blog.angel6.com, and, you might see stuff there. Because of how infrequent this will be, it might be 1 post a week, it might be none for 2 weeks, it could be 5 in a week. Instead of you going here and just refreshing, I decided to clean up and create a Angel6 Twitter account, which you can click on here. And then every time I put a post here, I'll try and remember to sign into Twitter and say, here's a post type of thing. So you can get notified as a follower if you want to, keep track when things happen. And I've also added a Discord discussion here, so you can sign in and post comments on here as well. So hopefully this will be useful to some of you when I start posting topics, but again, just go to blog.angel6.com for that. So that's it for this video. I hope it was useful. Any comments and anything going forward you'd like to see in this, series, do let me know.